The chapter begins on a tense and dramatic note as Jaekyung discovers Dan in the ocean, struggling to stay afloat. Without hesitation, he pulls Dan out of the water, visibly panicked and furious. He yells at Dan, questioning what could have driven him to walk into the ocean so late at night. Despite Jaekyung's desperate attempts to snap Dan out of his daze, Dan remains unresponsive. Jaekyung resorts to CPR, and after some effort, Dan momentarily regains consciousness. Confused, he internally wonders why he's seeing Jaekyung in front of him before slipping back into unconsciousness. Determined to save him, Jaekyung carries Dan to a nearby hospice, a facility named Light of Hope. There, he urgently seeks emergency care for Dan. As the medical staff take over, Dan begins to stir and weakly calls out Jaekyung's name. Jaekyung, still shaken, expresses his frustration at Dan's reckless behavior, telling him he could have lost his life if not for timely intervention. Dan, however, seems bewildered by Jaekyung's words, claiming he doesn't recall entering the ocean. He insists that he was simply on his way to the hospital. Jaekyung, taken aback, argues that Dan had clearly walked straight into the water, but Dan's memory remains a blank. A brief moment of silence follows as they exchange uncertain glances. The tension is palpable, with neither fully understanding the other's perspective. Dan finally asks why Jaekyung is there, his tone hinting at both curiosity and confusion. The story flashes back to a gym scene. Members of the team are chatting casually with Potato, a fellow trainee, who had been away for some time. They eagerly ask him about his experience shooting a movie, urging him to share pictures from the set. Potato obliges and starts sending photos to their group chat. However, in his haste, he accidentally includes a picture from the last day of filming, one that features Dan. The photo eventually catches Jaekyung's attention. Realizing the significance of the image, Jaekyung immediately confronts Potato, demanding answers about the photo's origin. Potato is caught off guard as Jaekyung shows him the image and presses for details. This revelation prompts Jaekyung to drive out to the location depicted in the photo, determined to find Dan. As he arrives in the middle of the night, Jaekyung's thoughts reveal his disbelief that Dan is staying in such an isolated area. Searching the vicinity, he spots Dan by the beach, once again heading toward the water. Then, the flashback ends, and the scene returns to the present in the hospital room. Dan is now resting in a hospital bed, with Jaekyung sitting nearby. Though relieved that Dan is safe, Jaekyung quickly shifts back to his usual direct approach. He urges Dan to return to his previous role as his physical therapist. Dan, however, firmly refuses. When Jaekyung pushes further, mentioning financial incentives and the possibility of settling debts quickly, Dan remains steadfast, stating he has no intention of returning. Even Jaekyung's mention of Dan's grandmother and her well-being fails to sway him. Dan reiterates that he resigned for a reason and has no desire to work under Jaekyung again. Jaekyung attempts a different approach, acknowledging past misunderstandings, including an incident involving a spray, but Dan refuses to change his mind. Frustrated, Jaekyung emphasizes that no other opportunity will offer the same financial benefits, but Dan still declines. As their conversation grows more heated, Dan makes it clear that he's done accepting money or favors from Jaekyung, no matter the circumstances. Defeated, Dan begins to leave the hospital room despite his injuries. Jaekyung protests, reminding him that the doctor advised rest, but Dan brushes him off. Bleeding and visibly weak, Dan walks away, leaving Jaekyung behind. Watching him leave, Jaekyung reflects on the situation, realizing that his usual tactics of using money and power to control others won't work with Dan this time.